Hi everyone. This is kind of an update or a part two, in a sense, to the video I made about Lady Hootsy and Ngosa Fulani. Some people have said that's not her real name. Um, if she's changed her name, I wouldn't read too much into that. People have a right to do it. It's not. I'm not going to say, oh, her real name is Tommy Robinson. Done the same thing. Quite a lot of people do. I wouldn't read too much into that. I'm just gonna call her the name that is there, that's out there. I suppose people could say it suggests a dishonesty, so I suppose it's not totally irrelevant, but just for simplicity's sake, yeah. Um, Paul Wally, you made some interesting responses to that video, and you mentioned a few things I didn't know actually. I didn't know, but I'm not surprised that Ngozi was a big supporter of Meghan Markle, and apparently said that she was a victim of domestic violence in block capitals. I agree with you. If that's something that she publicly stated, even Markle herself hasn't said that. She said that she felt lonely and depressed, and she said all the things that she said. I don't think even Meghan Markle has mentioned that she was a victim of domestic violence in the palace. But the irony there, of course, is that would mean it's Harry that's the fingers being pointed at. I mean, it's unlikely to be another member of the royal family if it was domestic violence. But that's a very serious thing to be saying for the head of a charity, a very slanderous thing to be saying. But the royal family, they don't sue people. They don't get involved in litigation in the same way as, say, a business person or something. They're kind of expected to rise above it. And I have a lot of sympathy. I mean, I'm a monarchist, a moderate monarchist, so it may be a bias in that regard. But I do have a lot of sympathy with the sheer amount of smears that the royal family has had to put up with in recent years, and they've basically had to, grit their teeth and put up with it. Um, Now, I understand the king has invited her to the palace, and apparently he did actually meet her as Prince of Wales as part of his Prince's Trust programs. Um, the thing is that she has apparently said she didn't want Lady Hooty to resign. Why has she resigned? Is it pressure from the king, pressure from the Prince of Wales? Was it her own accord? I do think it's interesting that she hasn't actually denied Ngotti's version of what happened. She hasn't said, "Oh no, I didn't repeat the question" or something like that. But maybe she's been advised to keep her head low. But I do think there is something a little bit ugly about this 83-year-old woman who's shown decades of loyal service and has apparently never had a controversy before, suddenly find herself vilified in some quarters, branded a racist. Um, I think I'm not saying that that means she's not, but there's something a little bit vindictive about it. And, I hope there's no vigilantism. I don't really think there will be, but it's a very unfortunate thing that what was supposedly a private conversation between two women has snowballed into this much bigger thing. And I maintain I don't think it should be a national conversation, although it's in the public domain, it's out there. So I want to talk a little bit more broadly about race in Britain in 2022 and how this is perceived, because there's so many angles to look at this. I mean, someone who's very much in the woke reactionary left would very much say, oh, racism is alive and well in Britain. We need to confront it. We need to decolonize the textbooks. Critical race theory is valid, and we need to push all these things. Now, a reactionary conservative might go in the total other direction, say, oh, racism, basically be in denial that any racism exists, and they might be a little bit too defensive, if we're being honest. I have personally witnessed racism against, for example, ethnic minority friends from drunk louts. Um, so I think it's wrong to say that it's not out there. I think it's wrong to say that there aren't ignorant people who frankly do have Um, if not racist intent, then willful ignorance. Um, I don't think Lady Hussey is a hardcore racist. I really don't. My gut feeling is she's kind of a little bit stuck in her ways. She's 83. She's an older generation. Maybe in her mind that was totally acceptable. Um, I've seen no evidence that she's any sort of white supremacist or anything like that. And I've noted a number of ethnic minority people have said they have often been asked the question and they don't, they didn't get offended. So I do think sometimes there's this tendency for self-described anti-racists or self-described community leaders to think that they're speaking for everyone. So, you could be sure the likes of Black Lives Matter will be all over this and say, "Oh, look, it's evidence." It's not really. It all depends on context and what exactly was said and the intent behind it. And I also think even if it was exactly as Ngozi said, it's still totally overblown. I think there's more important things going on in the world. I think actually, if the issue was around police power and what the police are doing in society, I think that's a much more important issue than a conversation between two women. Because regarding the police, that gets into a whole area of what powers do they have, what powers should they have. I'm conservative on crime, and I believe the police should be supported. But I do think that when, for example, someone dies in police custody, there have to be questions there. And I do have a big problem, a very big problem, with the fact that there are basically criminals serving, and the Metropolitan Police can't get rid of them. These are people who have basically convictions. There is a serious problem with that. So I think some conservatives can be a little bit defensive whenever it comes to anything to do with race or um, the police. They can be a little bit in denial of some of the problems. Having said that, Britain is not America, and I think it would be wrong to project some of the narratives that are going on there onto the UK, notably critical race theory. Um, if, for example, one particular community may be underrepresented, that is not a sign of institutional racism. This term institutional racism is really thrown around a lot. Um, if a black person doesn't get a particular job or a particular acting role, that is not a sign of institutional racism any more than if a white person didn't get it in a field perhaps that was dominated by black people. It doesn't necessarily mean the white person's being discriminated against. Um, I can tell you most Chinese restaurants legally they cannot discriminate. So they will sometimes here in Sunderland also you notice it saying staff want to apply within. But very often the managers will really be looking for Chinese staff because they think it's an aesthetic thing or something. But if a young person wanted a waitering job, um, and they said no, you can't. What if they've had experience? What if they've worked in other restaurants? So I do think there's obvious double standards. I mean, take her charity for example. Getting back to Ngozi Fulani here, if she says the reason it's catered towards black women is to address the gap in provision. Well, that in itself is kind of a claim. It's suggesting that the other domestic violence charities only cater to white women, which is obviously not true. They cater to all women. If anything, there's a discrepancy between provision of male victims of domestic violence. As it stands, there's only one single charity I can think of, which is the Mankind Initiative, a great charity. They do great work, but it's the only one that caters for male victims. So if there's any discrepancy, it's in that. If there's an issue with maybe women from a particular minority group who are not coming forward, they need to be encouraged and given the support to do that. But I think fundamentally racial segregation is a bad idea. I'm not against sex segregation in some areas. I think, for example, if there's a women's changing facility, it makes sense that only biological women are allowed in there. I don't want to muddy the waters and get into the whole trans issue, but I think that sex segregation makes more sense in some contexts. Some contexts, uh, race segregation in Britain in 2022. No, I'm not a fan of it. That's why I'm skeptical of things like the Black Police Association or even Black History Month. I think should be scrutinised because These things, there may be good intentions behind them for giving people a voice. Are they really helping minority people? That's the question. Or are they actually further, othering those people and saying, you're not just a police officer, you're a black police officer? Is that really helping that police officer to perhaps tackle issues that they might face? If, for example, if they're suffering racial bullying, is it not better to improve the system so that there's more outlets for any officer to report? And I think that probably does happen in the services, in the police, in the armed forces. I think anyone who says it doesn't exist is being very naive. Um, in any macho environment, there is a potential that that sort of bullying will take place. Um, and I think it would be wrong to say that it doesn't. So there has to be mechanisms in place to help minority people feel that they can get the resources they need. But I am still wary of segregation. Um, it goes without saying it's the opposite of the vision Martin Luther King Jr. And other civil rights activists of the 1960s envisaged. They didn't want a segregated community. Um, Ironically, some of the so-called anti-racists around today probably have more in common with Jim Crow segregationists in terms of their obsession with racial identity politics. It's incredible. Um, but in terms of the subject of racism, I'm sort of in the middle in terms of how it's approached because I don't say that it should be totally ignored, and I don't say that it doesn't exist. I think that would be wrong. I haven't walked in the shoes of someone else who maybe has directly experienced racism. And I haven't been in their shoes. I haven't seen their experience of if they've reported that to the police, what sort of response did they get, and all of that. I have not had that experience. And, racial abuse disgusts me. I think that any ignorant lout who can't shut their mouth and just, leave someone alone, I think that sort of behavior is disgusting. And I have personally witnessed it. This isn't, some sort of left wing invention. It is out there and it's unacceptable, and any reasonable person would condemn it. But I do not believe that we get the occasional ignorant person that is somehow evidence that Britain is a racist country. I think that is a gross smear on this country. I think we're probably one of the most welcoming countries on earth. I think generally the West is. Western Europe, Canada, the United States has a more complex racial history, but even the US, this is a country, for all the claims of institutional racism, millions of people voted for a black president. Mixed race, technically, but, if America was so racist, would Barack Obama have been able to serve 2 full terms of office? Of course not. If it was so deeply racist, he wouldn't have even got to the final stages. And there's lots of other areas that I think the United States has greatly improved. And the professional race mongers will not acknowledge it. That's not to say that there aren't serious problems that need to be addressed, but um, I always question the certain narrative that people go down, and I think one of them is definitely critical race theory. I think it's utterly toxic, and I think it should stay well away from universities and schools because I think it sends out this narrative to children, that if you're a minority, particularly if you're black, then any shortcoming that you have in life, blame the white people because they're benefiting from the system. So it's a very cynical, in my view, quite malicious way of poisoning young minds, really, rather than teaching people to see others as individuals, which is the way I think it should be. Um, so another problem that I have, and this whole story is a good example of it, is that when someone alleges racism, I'm not going to say cries racism because their version might be true, but when they allege racism, this also applies in the sexism thing, but particularly racism, they pretty much get a free pass from media interviews. particularly if it's like the BBC or Good Morning or something like that. What you will see is the journalists, the interviewers, will just let them sit down and share their entire account without challenge, without challenge. It's pretty much like, oh, can you tell us a bit about what happened? And that's awful. Tell us more. Now, I'm thinking, by all means, be polite, be respectful, listen to what they're saying. But they have a platform there, and if they're making certain claims that can't be substantiated, there is a job of any journalist to make the viewers aware of that. Also, to show the whole picture. So, for example, if I was interviewing Ngozi Fulani, I would certainly let her tell her side of it, and I would maybe follow up a bit on that. Like, do you think this is a particular problem in the country? Something like that. But I would also be following up. Um, you run this charity. Now, some of our viewers will be wondering, why do you not cater to white and Asian victims of domestic violence? Can you please address that point? I suspect you would get very defensive. Say, you're a white journalist asking me this. Da, 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 da. So this isn't just with the race thing. The Women's Equality Party, I mean, they're a small party, they're pretty insignificant, but I remember in the 2015 general election, they had a few interviews and they were given way, way too much airtime considering they were a small party. But the airtime that they did have was completely without question. You know, there was no challenges as other political parties would face. There was no sort of, are you basically against half the population? Because they insist that they're not, but it is a gender focused party. So, you know, I would basically play hardball with them. I would say to their leader, what do you think of men? Do you like men? You know, I put her on the spot and you should probably get offensive about it. But I think far too many activists don't get challenged anywhere near enough as they should be, anywhere near as much as they should be. Just Stop Oil is another example. Now, I suppose they have been challenged a bit more than the others because they have done such a good job of pissing off the country. But even the questions are not always the right questions. People might say, you know, they'll listen to their narrative, and I think they get way too many interviews. But, you know, when they are interviewed, GB News and other more conservative sources will definitely push them on their tactics. But what needs to happen even more is some of their actual claims. The dystopian claims, like millions of people are going to die in a few years. What needs to be put to them is that the intergovernmental body on climate change has actually not said some of the things that they're saying. So it certainly hasn't stated that millions of people will die in the next few years. What really galls me about Just Stop Oil is their inflammatory language. For example, they're accusing the British government of genocide. Genocide. So they're basically saying that the British government's environmental policy in 2022 is akin to what Hutu extremists done in 1994 in Rwanda. That's what genocide means. And I think they should tread very carefully there. I think that an interviewer needs to really grill them on that. Do you think it's responsible to be using the word genocide? I personally would give them far less interviews. I think they've had far more airtime than they deserve. I would do a lot more interviews with the people that they are disrupting. But that's just me. So anyway, I'm going to wrap this up. But um, I'm a white guy. I've never experienced direct racism in this country. In China, I don't know. There was a few times I was walking past people and I heard the word Lao Wai muttered. The Lao Wai in Chinese basically literally translates as foreigner or old foreigner. And that's very much, it could be good or bad depending on the context. Sometimes it's done in a sort of amicable way, like our old foreign friend. And I'm not offended by that. But especially with older generations, it could be a little bit hostile, like, oh, not quite as bad as White Devil, but you know, they're Mao's generation. They're still suspicious of outsiders on some level. So I could have played the victim and said, you know, I was a victim of racism in China, but I just didn't know enough of the context to say that. I certainly had a lot of experiences where I was cheated, and maybe it's because I was a foreigner. Maybe it's because they thought, oh, this tourist is easy to. I wasn't actually a tourist, but maybe foreigners are a softer target. So could I have said that I was a victim of racism in China? Not really. I'm reluctant to say that. I think they would cheat other Chinese as well. I mean, I remember when I was with certain friends, they would ask locals to speak in the national language, Putonghua, Mandarin, rather than the local dialect, because they felt that they might be cheated because China is a huge country. But I digress. Um, I think overt sensitivity combined with a victimhood mindset is a very potentially bad thing because especially when you get people then running to demand legislation and demand that someone is fired, partly because of social media and the internet, we do live in a sort of how can I put it? It's this very reactionary sort of situation. So a story like this in the past, it would have been on the newspapers and possibly news media, but that would be it. There would be no social media. So the number of people that it reached would be less. It wouldn't have been such a big thing. Not to this extent. Definitely not to this extent. And this is not for new. I mean, this is something that's been going on for a number of years now, where you get a controversy like this and it snowballs, and then there's a whole thing about let's have a national conversation. But I abhor racism. I think it's a very ugly thing. I think that abusing someone because of the color of the skin is abhorrent. I think xenophobia is also bad. I think any form of that sort of prejudice is bad and it should be shunned. And I think that if you have, for example, some drunk lout who's mouthing off to a stranger, he or she needs to be called out and potentially face criminal charges. They, especially if it's physical. But yeah, even if they're verbally abusing a stranger, to the point where that person is really in distress, I think they should face some sort of consequences. But you know, if we're getting to a point where there's a conversation between two women and there's a misunderstanding or something is interpreted a certain way, what really bothers me is the concept of microaggressions, for example. I mean, there are people out there, believe me, woke activists who would have microaggressions policed. Um, I gave my own example about Northern Irish identity. Now, like I say, occasionally it gets on my nerves when people don't listen to what I'm saying. I would never dream of saying that should be legislated on, or this person needs sensitivity training. My attitude is they can piss off. It's you know, I'm not going to make it a bigger issue than me and them necessarily, although I have dealt with it a lot. But I'm not going to say that I'm a victim. I'm not going to say that we need a national conversation about this. And I also think that if you are portraying a certain culture, and this is also something you brought up, Paul. I understand Nkosi was wearing West African attire. Well, what does she expect? It is quite hypocritical to play a certain cultural trait and then complain that it gets attention. That's just makes no sense. Um, People will ask questions. Um, I'm going to wrap this up, but it's just sad that people make race into such a bigger thing than it needs to be, in the sense that getting offended and choosing to make it into a really big thing, um, how people perceive their experience is something that they alone can think about. But this constant situation of weaponizing racism, that is throwing it around, and the left really do this, I think is quite contemptible. And I think the collective media also have a lot to answer for because they lap up race stories like manna from heaven. It's very cynical and it's very some are a bit more responsible than others. But what really bothers me, and again, this is the left that's mostly guilty of it, they will just take the racist exchange or the racist courtier. They will just label this woman or the situation without just being a little bit more nuanced and saying, can we interpret this as racism? Or, asking more questions. It's just becoming too overly simplistic and overly weaponized. So if you are a minority person and you've suffered racist abuse, I have enormous sympathy for you. If that turned into a violent encounter or that turned into a situation of, you really felt harassed, I think you should have the right to have that person should face some consequences. If it's online, no. I have a big problem with policing online, unless it's a threat. I think the only time, frankly, the police should get involved in social media, the only time, is if there is an explicit threat, for example, from a terrorist group or to an individual's life. I don't think the police have any business basically policing social media. And I think there's too many police forces in England and Wales to take it on themselves to look into this stuff. Um, to be fair, the Chief Constable of Greater Manchester Police has advocated a back to basics approach. That is to say, let's focus on crime. Let's focus on actual empirical crime. That's what people want to see. They don't want someone getting a knock on their door because they used the wrong pronoun online, or maybe they said they were made a racist comment online. Frankly, they shouldn't do it, and they should be called out on it. You know, but I just think that this censorious atmosphere, this controlling atmosphere, if you cannot say that, so you will be censored. It's better that someone just gets challenged on their bigotry, and by all means challenge them. But this, with social media, you find that you're walking on eggshells because I've been in this situation where I've had to defend myself against false racist claims, and I got reported simply for defending myself. And I got my account suspended for like 2 days, which was an inconvenience. But it's like walking on eggshells. Um, I was going to say something else. I kind of lost my trail of thought, but um, I don't deny racism. I think it is out there. I don't think it's gone, but I do not think that the way the woke left portray it, that Britain's a steeply racist country, that we need to decolonize everything. I think they're dead wrong, and I think that they are stoking the flames. Not every misunderstanding between a white person and a minority person is racism, and to weaponize that is very, very cynical. And finally, anti-white racism. Why is it the only form of racism that gets a free pass? Why? If you say that you're anti-racist, and it's the very sort of people who would label themselves anti-racists, they would laugh at the idea of anti-white racism. They would say, well, whites are the majority, so it doesn't happen. They would ignore the fact that the grooming gangs across northern England and the Midlands specifically targeted white girls because they saw them as cheap and easy. That's racist. By any definition, it is pure racism. So I think the media is largely culpable for this. Their selective outrage. If there's a white murder victim, that will not get the same attention as an ethnic minority murder victim. I think the issues around race are definitely legitimate to discuss. We can discuss, for example, why is it that so many young black men in London are killing each other? Why is it the white working class boys are, disproportionately represented in academic prowess? So those things need to be discussed. That's fine. But this constant hypersensitivity and micromanagement of wording is bullshit. And I really think it causes a lot more harm than good. So let's have open discussion, but let's not constantly have this situation where people are being threatened with legal repercussions. Unless it's a genuinely serious situation where there's been a racist assault or profound racial abuse. But simply being offended online should not be a reason for someone to face the other person to face legal ramifications. The same applies to the trans issue. Let me know your thoughts.